Thanks for your watching my video. Reveal that Victoria had never trusted happiness that arrived too quickly, too neatly, and too perfectly with a single scratch to prove it was real. To her, true happiness always came with a cost, a quiet sacrifice, or a fear you had to hide carefully just to keep everything standing. When she saw Clare smiling, when she heard the Newman family trying to convince themselves that her daughter could finally live with less weight on her shoulders, Victoria felt an even sharper chill settle under her skin. It wasn't jealousy of Clare's joy, and it wasn't the selfish control of a mother who couldn't let go. It was the instinct of a woman raised among betrayals wrapped in sweetness, among handshakes that could turn into a noose, among people who knew how to appear at the exact moment someone was desperate so that need could be turned into a trap. And Holden, no matter how he entered the conversation as nothing more than a brief romance in Los Angeles, hovered in Victoria's mind like an unanswered question that was too large, too dark, and too persistent to ignore. Clare Grace Newman was no longer the fragile girl who needed to be shielded from the world. She had taken enough hits to understand that the Newman name was both privilege and curse. Yet that was precisely why she longed to belong somewhere without constantly having to prove she deserved a seat at the table. She wanted to be seen as her own person, not as a problem to be managed, not as a weak link inside an empire that ran on power. There was something heartbreakingly pure in that craving, and something dangerous that Clare herself couldn't recognize. Anyone who touched the buried insecurity beneath it could lead her anywhere. Clare had shared a fleeting moment with Holden Novak in Los Angeles, and to her it had been nothing more than a brief detour, just enough to feel understood, just enough to believe she could be someone outside the Newman shadow. She closed that door on purpose because she didn't want a romantic relationship with Holden, especially with a secret tied to Audra Charles hanging around her like a live wire. Keeping Holden at a distance felt like safety. Keeping him as a friend felt like control. And that thin-thread friendship, not romance, was exactly what frightened Victoria most. Because Victoria knew the ugliest dangers rarely arrived by smashing down a door. They slipped in through the smallest opening you chose to leave unlocked, and then you called it trust. At first, the signs were nothing more than tiny misalignments, subtle changes in rhythm. Clare began making decisions that harmed Newman Enterprises, yet she carried herself as if she were doing something necessary, something right in a moral sense she never fully explained. Her caution shifted. Her priorities shifted. Sometimes even her tone shifted in ways that made the people around her exchange confused glances. At times she sounded unusually rigid, as if she had memorized an argument, as if invisible hands had placed conclusions in her mind and were simply waiting for the right moment to release them. At other times she softened in the strangest places, offering ground where she once would have drawn a line. It felt as though her emotions were being stretched between two extremes, her ability to balance herself slowly dissolving. For the Newman family, these choices weren't merely about financial loss or power slips. They shook the core belief that the inside of the house was still safe. An empire could survive enemies outside its gates. It was always most vulnerable when the threat sat at the conference table with the face of a loved one, the voice of a daughter, and eyes that insisted they meant well. Victoria watched Clare with the disciplined restraint of someone who had spent her life treating every relationship like a battlefield. She forced herself not to strike too soon, because she knew an impulsive reaction could push Clare farther away, could drive her into clinging to something outside the family just to prove she wasn't being controlled. Victoria understood that the more powerful the mother, the easier it was to paint her as a tyrant. And that was the weakness any manipulator would exploit, convince Clare that the Newmans didn't truly trust her. That concern was just surveillance in a nicer outfit. That advice was always strategy disguised as love, and Clare would walk right out of protection and into danger with the smug, intoxicating feeling that she was reclaiming her freedom. Victoria replayed recent moments in her mind like evidence on a table, Clare's evasions whenever Holden came up, the split-second hesitations as if she were listening to a silent cue, the way she spoke of a higher purpose in language that didn't feel like her own. Victoria's unease stopped being vague. It sharpened into something with a clear edge. There was an unseen force shaping Clare, and that force understood Clare better than her family did. Victoria couldn't ask directly. She couldn't make it public. She began investigating in secret, collecting small clues the way you follow the smell of smoke to find the fire. The deeper she went, the more she realized the story between Clare and Holden was never as simple as a brief romance that faded into nothing. Holden had shared pieces of himself with Clare, but not the full story. And the terrifying part was that Clare had sensed it too. Her intuition had warned her that Holden was hiding something, and that was exactly why she had kept him at the safer distance of friendship, refusing to accept the feeling of being kept in the dark. But Victoria understood the bitter truth. Keeping someone as just a friend doesn't make them weaker in your life. Sometimes it makes them easier to trust, easier to welcome, easier to forgive. A lover can be questioned for motives. A friend is often excused because they only want what's best. Holden moved with precision inside that safer label. He didn't need to force Clare. He only needed to shape how she saw the world. The way you redirect a river by placing one stone in the right spot. He exploited the insecurity Clare had always tried to bury. The fear that she was an outsider inside her own family. That acceptance came with conditions. That any mistake would become proof she didn't deserve the Newman name. Holden touched Clare's hunger to belong and dressed it in beautiful words, telling her she could earn her place by doing the right thing. That she could prove she wasn't like the other Newmans by acting according to conscience. That she could become the one who repaired the moral fractures inside an empire that had run on power for too long. When Clare faced difficult choices, Holden handed her a map that made everything simpler. The Newmans might be strong, but they could also be wrong. And if Clare wanted to be different, she had to be willing to put them at a disadvantage so they would be forced to change. It sounded like justice. It sounded like growth. It sounded like the exact higher purpose Clare wanted to believe in so she could soothe the bruises she never admitted existed. And because it sounded so right, it was lethal. Clare's actions became hard to understand not because she was losing her mind, but because she was living inside a private logic that only she and Holden could see. To Clare, every decision that damaged Newman interests had a reason. She didn't think she was betraying her family. She believed she was saving them from themselves. She didn't think she was sabotaging. She believed she was testing them, cleansing them, forcing them to face truths they always avoided. She interpreted her family's confusion as proof they lacked the courage to change. And every time she saw that confusion, Clare leaned harder into Holden's one person who didn't judge her. The one voice that confirmed she wasn't wrong. The cycle fed itself. Clare drifted farther from her family. The family became more helpless, and Holden became the invisible center of Clare's choices. Victoria began to see what others couldn't name yet. Clare was being turned into a weapon not through violence, but through psychology. And the most dangerous weapon is the one that believes it was created to do good. Victoria gathered more evidence of the suspicious link between Clare and Holden, not only in their shared past in Los Angeles, not only in Clare's forced calm whenever his name surfaced, but in the timing of Holden's presence. He appeared too perfectly whenever Clare wavered, too perfectly whenever family pressure tightened around her, too perfectly whenever she needed someone who understood. Victoria saw the gradual rewiring of Clare's mental. Clare's longing to belong as a Newman had shifted into a longing to stand against the Newmans, just to prove she was her own person. It was so subtle that Clare mistook it for maturity. What made it worse was that Clare wasn't completely blind. Deep down, guilt started to flicker through her like faint light under a door. There were moments when she saw the consequences of her decisions and felt breathless, as if she had crossed a line and hadn't known it would feel so cold. There were moments when she caught a family member's ice-not angry eyes, but wounded once, and in those seconds Clare felt something inside her fracture. Her old intuition returned, whispering again that Holden had never told her everything. But because Holden had only ever given her fragments, the most reasonable fragments, the easiest fragments to trust each time, Clare doubted. She convinced herself she was being manipulated by her family, that she was losing her nerve, that she had to stay loyal to the higher purpose. Her guilt wasn't strong enough to break the loop, but it was strong enough to steal her sleep, to drain her energy, to make her feel lost between what felt right and what was costing her everything. Victoria was horrified as the picture finally sharpened. The shock wasn't only that Holden was behind it. The shock was how he had done it without leaving crude fingerprints so he could present himself as someone helping Clare become stronger and freer. Victoria knew that if she stormed in and accused him outright, she might only reinforce the story Holden had planted in Clare's mind, that the Newmans feared Clare's independence, that they would use power to crush her choices. Victoria was trapped in a brutal dilemma. To save her daughter, she would have to become the villain in her daughter's eyes. And if she didn't save her, Clare would keep burning bridges until she became the perfect instrument for a deep, personal revenge aimed at the long-standing Newman empire. This was no longer about a fleeting romance or a friendship complicated by secrets. It was about an internal threat taking shape, and it wore Clare's face. The Newman family could feel something cracking even if they didn't know the full truth. Every harmful decision Clare made was like a thin bladder, rarely fatal on its own, but steadily bleeding trust dry. The harder they tried to stay calm, the more helpless they became. And in that helplessness, the risk of division grew. One person wanted softness to pull Clare back. Another wanted harsh boundaries to stop the damage. Someone wanted to believe in Clare. Someone wanted to treat her as a danger. Victoria saw it all and understood that if the family couldn't unite, Holden would win without ever stepping into the light. Because Holden didn't need direct power. He needed isolation. He needed Clare separated from the only people who could still rescue her. Holden's true endgame began to show itself through signs Victoria couldn't ignore. This wasn't a petty stunt meant to embarrass the Newmans once. It was revenge with depth, aimed at the foundation of the empire, aimed at the family's pride, aimed at the sense of invulnerability the Newmans wore like armor. And to pierce that armor, nothing was more effective than using someone from inside the house, using love and fear and the hunger to belong, transforming Clare into the blade. Holden didn't need to break the door. He only needed Clare to open it from the inside, convinced she was doing something righteous. Meanwhile, Clare was stretched between two worlds. On one side was the Newman family with its history of power, its gaze that could feel like love and suspicion at once, its questions that sounded to Clare like judgment. On the other side was Holden, offering understanding in carefully measured doses, offering guidance that tasted like salvation, offering the sense of belonging Clare had always lacked. Clare told herself she and Holden were only friends, that everything was under control, that she wasn't in love and therefore couldn't be trapped. But Victoria knew better. Manipulation doesn't require romance. It requires dependence. It requires the belief that someone sees you. And Clare, no matter how intelligent, cried an old wound around belonging, and Holden's fingers were pressed directly into that wound. Victoria knew she had to act, but she had to act without breaking Clare. She needed a way to free her daughter from Holden's grip before it was too late, and that way couldn't be a simple exposure. It had to reconnect Clare to her own instincts, to the part of her that had once refused to accept Holden's secrecy. It had to make Clare see the trap without feeling cornered. But time was something Victoria didn't have. With every day that passed, Clare moved closer to a choice that couldn't be Endenion, that could either cripple the Newman empire or make Clare into someone with no path back home. The pressure crushed Victoria from all sides. She was a mother terrified of losing her child, a guardian of an empire that couldn't survive an internal strike, and a woman who understood that a single wrong step could destroy both. Clare's guilt grew heavier. There were moments when she looked in the mirror and couldn't recognize who she was becoming. A strong woman brave enough to challenge her family. Or upon being pushed across a board by a hand she refused to see. She wanted to trust Holden because trusting him meant believing her pain had meaning. That she wasn't merely the Newman who was taken in. That she could leave her own mark. Yet every time she remembered the feeling that Holden hadn't told her everything, darkness stirred at the edge of her thoughts like footsteps behind her that she was afraid to turn toward. She repeated that they were only friends, that she hadn't allowed emotion to cloud her judgment. But her judgment was being shaped piece by piece, and that was what made it terrifying. She believed she was clear-eyed, while in reality she was walking on rails someone else had laid down. The Newmans faced an impossible choice: protect the empire or protect Clare, even though the truth was they had to do both and could not afford failure on either side. The unity they needed wasn't a slogan. It was discipline, silence, strategy, holding steady so they didn't accidentally drive Clare straight into Holden's arms. Victoria had to persuade them to be patient, to resist turning their fear into pressure. But every fresh damage Clare caused eroded their restraint. And that was exactly what Holden wanted. Enough chaos to fracture the family, enough tension to isolate Clare, enough momentum to finish arming the weapon from within. What finally made Victoria feel something collapse inside her wasn't a dramatic public reveal or a single undeniable document. It was the sick realization that Clare had been shaped longer than Victoria had understood. Holden hadn't merely influenced a decision. He had taught Clare to see the Newmans as a wall that needed to be broken instead of a home that needed repair. Victoria's guilt tightened like a fist. She had fought so many battles outside that she hadn't noticed the real battlefield was inside her daughter's heart. And in that guilt, Victoria grasped one colder truth: she couldn't save Clare by using the force of the Newman name. Because the Newman name itself was what Holden had turned into an obsession inside Clare. Victoria would have to save her with truth, consistency, and a willingness to reach the human part of Clare before the weapon became complete. Just when Victoria believed she had enough clues to begin pulling Clare out of Holden's control, her intuition jolted like time suddenly collapsed. Something was approaching a breaking point. Clare looked calmer than before, too calm. The calm of someone who had already decided and was simply waiting to act. And Holden, still hovering in the blurred edges of the story, seemed to be moving closer to the moment he would finally reveal his true endgame. Victoria stood in the heavy silence of her own fear. Understanding this was no longer about whether she had reason to worry about Clare's connection to Holden. It was about whether she could reach her daughter in time before Clare became the hand that pulled the trigger against her own family. And just as Victoria prepared to make her decisive move, a new sign appeared on so stark it left her numb with realization. Clare had already reached the point of no return. And Holden only needed one final push to make the weapon fire from inside Newman itself. Victoria had learned something early in life. The most dangerous person isn't the one who shouts threats, but the one who waits patiently at the edge, studying your weak points, then stepping in at the exact moment you believe you're strong enough not to get hurt anymore. That was why, as the warning signs around Clare sharpened into something undeniable, Victoria refused to soothe herself with the easy lie that this was just a temporary crisis or a youthful lapse in judgment. She could feel calculation moving beneath the glossy surface of the Newman world, a coldness that couldn't be explained away by jealousy, mistakes, or misunderstandings. Every instinct in her screamed that Holden was not merely a former acquaintance from Los Angeles, not merely a name that drifted in and out of Clare's past. He felt like a key that had been quietly filed down for months, waiting for the day it could slide into the lock of the Newman empire. What kept Victoria awake wasn't only the damage Clare's decisions were doing to the company, but the unsettling calm with which Clare stepped over the consequences, as if someone had helped her interpret every fracture through a private moral system. Clare didn't believe she was betraying her family. She moved like someone convinced she was doing something necessary, perhaps even nobler. That conviction made Victoria's fear turn razor sharp. A person who knows they're wrong can still stop. A person who believes they're right will walk to the edge and keep going, even if the edge is a cliff that destroys everyone they love. Victoria looked at her daughter and sensed a distance forming, not the ordinary distance between generations, but the distance of a mind being guided, reinforced by carefully chosen affirmations from someone outside the family. Victoria knew she couldn't keep watching from the sidelines. Every day she hesitated was another day Holden had to sink his hooks deeper into Clare's psyche. Victoria chose to confront him directly, and she chose the Newman offices as her stage without ever saying a word about it. This wasn't just where she worked. It was territory, symbol, the beating heart of everything Holden was trying to reach. If he intended to use Clare as a pathway into the Newman empire, Victoria would force him to stand at that very doorway and confess who he truly was. When she stepped into the confrontation, she didn't carry explosive anger. She carried something far more dangerous, the calm of a woman prepared to hear the ugliest truth and still remain standing. She began with what she had sensed in the relationship between Holden and Clare, emphasizing that what was happening could not be coincidence. Her questions landed like small, precise cuts, leaving Holden no room to hide behind vagueness or play the victim. She demanded the truth here and now, because everything had gone too far for politeness to matter. Holden stopped pretending, and in that moment Victoria knew she hadn't imagined any of it. His expression shifted as if the mask had finally grown tired of being worn. The coldness that emerged wasn't the coldness of a man who felt insulted, it was the coldness of someone who could afford to confess because he believed it was already too late to stop him. When Victoria pressed harder, Holden didn't merely admit the truth. He revealed it with a chilling certainty, almost as if he were proud of how cleanly he had executed the plan. He confessed that he had been manipulating Clare, treating her as a crucial piece in a larger game. The truth dropped into the Newman office like a heavy object that made no sound, yet shook everything inside Victoria. There was no fog left, no room for doubt. This was strategy. This was structure. And Clare was the most convenient doorway. Holden admitted his goal was never love, never a complicated romance, never even the lingering ache of something unfinished. His goal was power, a massive share of Newman, wealth, something so enormous it only required a single crack in trust to be hollowed out from within. He didn't look at Clare as a person, he looked at her as an instrument, a living key to doors he could never open through strength alone. He made it plain that he was using Clare as a pawn in a bigger scheme aimed at the center of Victor's empire. By controlling Clare, he could place her near decisions involving inheritance, internal authority, and access. And if he couldn't secure ownership, he could still secure destruction. As long as Clare continued acting under the false belief that she was doing the right thing, Holden would have a blade sharpening itself inside the Newman family. Victoria felt the shock hit like a slap across her pride. It wasn't that she couldn't imagine someone targeting the Newmans had lived with that reality her entire life. What sickened her was the cruelty in the way Holden had chosen Clare. He hadn't attacked with brute force. He hadn't threatened with violence. He hadn't needed to challenge Victor directly. He had simply identified a young woman carrying a deep insecurity about belonging and turned that insecurity into a strategic opening. The most brutal realization was that everything Holden had ever said to Clare may have been designed from the beginning to make Clare feel chosen while quietly pushing her to sever her ties to her family. And if the plan succeeded, Clare wouldn't just lose safety. She would lose herself, becoming the person who caused the ruin with her own hands and then had to live with the guilt forever. Victoria's rage didn't explode into noise. It compressed, heavy and cold, like lava trapped beneath stone. She looked at Holden and finally saw the full measure of his danger. He wasn't reckless, was patient, psychologically precise. The kind of man who could make his victim walk willingly into a trap and call it a choice. Victoria's stare hardened into something that could cut through excuses. She understood that this confrontation wasn't simply about unmasking Holden. It was the beginning of a different world war to reclaim Clare. Because if Holden was confessing this openly, it meant he believed his influence inside Clare was already deep enough that even if the Newmans learned the truth, pulling her out would still be difficult without breaking her. Victoria was forced to face the most painful question. How could she protect Clare when the very act of protection might become the reason Clare pushed the family away? Victoria knew that if she ran to Clare and told her everything outright, Clare might react exactly the way Holden had conditioned her to react, believing it was a Newman smear campaign. Believing they feared her voice, believing they were trying to strip away her independence. Holden had turned suspicion into a shield. He had trained Clare to see resistance from her family as proof she was on the right path, That realization tightened around Victoria's throat, because she understood she was stepping into a maze whose walls Holden had already built. But Victoria also knew she had no right to retreat. If she hesitated, Holden would advance, and every step he took could push Clare closer to an irreversible choice tied to inheritance, internal control, or a sabotage big enough to shake Victor's grip. For Victoria, this was never only about protecting money. It was about protecting her daughter's soul, protecting Clare's chance to come back and still believe that family was refuge rather than prison. Victoria reminded herself that Clare had once sensed something off about Holden, that she had once felt he was hiding parts of the truth. That meant there was still a clear-eyed part of Clare buried underneath the conditioning, a part not fully bent out of shape. Victoria had to wake that part up before Holden replaced it with a perfect, manufactured faith. The confrontation ended without an easy victory, leaving behind only a bitter resolve. Victoria walked away from the Newman offices feeling as though she had finally met the real enemy and still hadn't saved the person she loved most. Holden's confession was only the beginning, because the real battle wasn't proving he was dangerous. It was pulling Clare out of the orbit he had engineered. Victoria understood that if she made the wrong move, Clare would run straight back to Holden for validation, and Holden would use the family's panic to tighten his grip. But if she made the right move, if she struck the one weakness Holden couldn't fully control, the complete truth he had tried to keep hidden, Victoria still had a chance. And just as she started to map the next step in her mind, another terrifying thought clenched inside her. If Holden was willing to confess to Victoria, then he was already preparing his next move, a move he believed would leave Clare listening to no one but him. Victoria could almost hear the gears of something dark and unstoppable turning. She knew she had to reach Clare before Holden delivered that final push, but her greatest fear was that the new assignment had already been placed in Clare's hands. And as Victoria stepped out of the office, she couldn't tell whether she was running to save her daughter or running to stop the blow Clare was about to strike against the Newman family from the inside.